Let me explain why government should not be in the business of funding science, or at least should do it in a completely different way from how it's done today. My name is Mike Adams, the Health Ranger. I am a food research scientist. I run an analytical laboratory. I'm the author of Food Forensics, available at foodforensics.com, by the way, if you want to download a chapter for free. I run mass spec instrumentation and time of flight instrumentation, ICP-MS, things like that. And I've come to find that the fact that I have a private lab that isn't funded by government is extraordinarily empowering, but also extremely rare. Almost everybody else conducting science has financial ties to government or universities, which is also government in an indirect way. And as a result, they aren't free to really conduct the research that they want to do, and they're not free to reach the conclusions that they want to reach because the government funding science pulls the strings. And if you think government is independent on science, then you're simply not informed of how government uses science to twist things and to run its own political agendas in the name of science. This happens at the EPA, the FDA, the USDA, the CDC. These are all government-related organizations that twist science, and some of them commit scientific fraud. Actually, all of them do. And they actively suppress independent science, and they engage in punitive measures to silence the kind of science that they don't want conducted. So, for example, if any scientist publishes a paper that criticizes the government's current policies on anything such as biosludge from the EPA, or pharmaceutical safety, or vaccine safety, or GMOs under the USDA, any scientist who criticizes those policies immediately gets their funding cut off, and they get professionally destroyed. And so the government uses really financial extortion systemically. This is what they do across the board. Sort of the threat of, if your science doesn't support our politics, we're going to cut off your funding and close your lab and take away all the grant money from you and take away your employees and so on. This is also true when it comes to global warming science. Any scientist whose conclusions do not support the global warming political agenda finds themselves very quickly cut off from scientific funds and cut off from speaking as a scientist, cut off from having their papers published in the most prestigious scientific journals, cut off from lucrative or teaching positions at Ivy League schools, or even cut off from possible government positions, government, let's say, advisors, or even consultants who might work on scientific issues. It's all cut off because you didn't reach the right conclusions that the government wanted you to reach. And so, as a result, the science, the so-called science that we get in the United States, is not real science at all. If it's funded by government, then it's fake science. It's distorted. It's the politicized science that the government wants to be produced. And that isn't science. Science, real science, is supposed to be welcome to dissenting views, discussion and debate. Real science isn't afraid of evidence that might counter the current known models or the accepted theories of how things happen. Real science knows that science moves forward and advances by overthrowing the old outdated ideas and replacing them with new expanded ideas and expanded levels of understanding. And yet the government that funds science wants to keep science locked in a box that it controls, so that real science never has a chance to be carried out, and real science never has a chance to contradict the politicized positions and statements and policies that government bureaucrats have put in place. For example, on global warming, they can't have somebody contradicting their views on global warming. They can't have science that shows, well, the Earth hasn't been warming. or that the polar caps aren't melting, or that the oceans aren't rising, for example, any science that would even dare entertain such ideas must be completely censored and defunded. And any scientist that would carry out something like that must be punished and even destroyed. There's a great book on this called Science for Sale, and it's by a former EPA scientist called David Lewis, Lewis. And this is one of the most extraordinary science books of our generation. Even though it was published in 2014, I didn't get a chance to read it until this year, 2016, and this book opened my eyes and blew my mind. I mean, I knew that government was conducting scientific fraud, but I never knew the extent of it. I never knew that the EPA, for example, during the biosludge debate, actually sent armed agents out to arrest and intimidate scientists in their own homes late at night to silence those scientists who were opposed to the EPA's bizarre conclusions about the safety of biosludge. I never knew that the EPA would target scientists who reviewed papers, the peer review process. So when David Lewis would write a paper that showed the dangers of biosludge, the EPA would go after any other scientist who simply engaged in peer review of David Lewis's paper. Those other scientists would be targeted for intimidation and cut off from their funds and have their grant money eliminated and all of these other things. That's a real viciousness against science that's carried out by the EPA. And so David Lewis says in that book, he says there's really no reliable science being conducted in the United States that has anything to do with government policy or corporate interests. He says the only truly reliable science that exists today is the science that's conducted on things that don't really matter. But on anything that does matter, anything that is related to government policy or corporate profits, the science is all twisted and fraudulent. And he uses words like that. He says you can't trust any of that science because it's so easy to have it twisted and fabricated. So David Lewis knows exactly what's happened, and what's interesting is if you look across the CDC, the FDA, the USDA, and the EPA, you find that whistleblowers are routinely intimidated and silenced. Look at Dr. David Graham of the FDA. He blew the whistle many years ago on the dangers of Vioxx. And according to his math, from being a top scientist inside the FDA, that one drug, Vioxx, killed more Americans than died in the entire Vietnam War. Far beyond 50,000 Americans were killed by Vioxx. And he tried to sound the alarm on that, and of course the FDA desperately and very effectively silenced him and shut him up, just as the CDC has silenced Dr. William Thompson, a whistleblower who also went public saying that he and other scientists at the CDC took part in a deliberate cover-up to alter the data linking vaccines to autism in African American boys. In fact, you can go across every agency, whether it's USDA, FDA, EPA, CDC, and others, and you can find whistleblowers who were threatened, intimidated, or silenced, and a lot of that was done to send a message to other would-be whistleblowers to let them know, hey, if you dare speak out, we're going to destroy you. And some people have ended up in prison for being whistleblowers. So the science that is paraded as science is largely fraudulent. And the government funding science produces the scientific results that the government wants to see for political reasons. In other words, when there's government money in science, it isn't science at all. It's just fraud, parading as science. Same thing's true with corporations. If you have big, powerful corporations paying for scientific studies like drug company studies or Monsanto with GMOs and so on, they're going to only hire scientists that produce the results they want to see. And so this corporate-funded science also isn't real science. It's scientific fraud. It's misrepresentation, or as Dr. David Lewis describes it, institutionalized scientific malpractice. And he's very much right about that. So you have to think very carefully about when people say, oh, government should fund more scientific research. That kind of statement is usually made by somebody who is naive about how government really works. You know, the idea sounds good at first, like, yeah, let's invest in scientific advancement and understanding. Let's develop new technologies. You know, let's advance science in the name of humanity. But that's not how the money gets used. The money actually gets used to control scientists and to threaten them with having their money taken away unless they become obedient followers of the policies that the government wants to push, which are more often than not based on anti-science ideas. And so it is astonishing that the conclusion from all of this is that there is no stronger anti-science organization than the government itself. The FDA is an anti-science regulator of drugs. The EPA is an anti-science regulator of pollutants. The USDA is an anti-science Department of Agriculture. The CDC is an anti-science vaccine-pushing organization. None of these follow the tenets, the principles of real science. They produce fake science under the label of science to push their specific agendas, which are usually based on promoting something that's earning a lot of money for somebody else. In the case of the FDA, it's promoting pharmaceuticals. In the case of the CDC, it's promoting vaccines. In the case of the USDA, it's promoting the biotech industry. In the case of the EPA, it's promoting all the large corporate entities that engage in the mass chemical pollution that goes into the biosludge that the EPA says it's safe to spread on farms and school playgrounds and city parks all across America. And it is being spread across all those areas right now. So it's interesting when journalists in the mainstream media, I'm not even sure you can call them journalists, people pretending to be journalists in the mainstream media, they like to say that anyone who attacks the CDC is anti-science. Yet the CDC itself is the most anti-science organization on the vaccine front. So to attack an anti-science organization is actually promoting legitimate science. So when I'm attacking the FDA, for example, I'm attacking the anti-science fraud of the FDA. Or if I'm attacking the EPA, I'm attacking its anti-science fraud, meaning I'm the one defending real science. I'm the scientist. They're the fraudsters. And it's not just me that is the scientist. It's people like David Lewis. It's people like William Thompson. It's people like David Graham. And hundreds of others who are all real scientists trying to operate with transparency and scientific truth in an environment that is dominated by scientific fraud from the government on down. So those are the things that you need to think about if you really hope to understand regulation, the government's role in funding science and science journals, and what is real science versus what is fraudulent science. You need to know where the money has come from to produce the science, and you need to question anything that is funded by government. The National Institutes of Health, NIH, the National Science Foundation, the NSF, and many other groups. All the money that comes from these organizations is money that is spent to corrupt science and produce fake science, not to produce real science. And by the way, any real scientist would confirm exactly what I'm saying. And the only ones who won't, on the record, are people who are afraid of the retaliation that they're going to receive. But if you take them off the record, a quiet conversation off the record, they will tell you exactly what I'm saying here. It is the scientists inside the EPA and inside the FDA that know that their agencies are committing scientific fraud. And many of them are strongly opposed to it, and they'd like to speak out, but they know they will be destroyed. They will lose their jobs and their pensions and their benefits, and they may even be prosecuted because the government is so serious about controlling the scientific realm, the cognitive map of science, if you will, that it is willing to use mafia-style tactics of intimidation and threats and cutting off funds and even jailing scientists. So we are living in an age similar to the age in which Galileo lived, and it is we, the independent scientists, who are the Galileos of the world, trying to share the truth in an age that is dominated by institutions founded in irrationality and fraud, which in Galileo's days was the Catholic Church, and today it is government and corporate-funded scientism. But it's the same situation, just a different age. The church, of course, used the same tactics of intimidation and censorship against anyone who dared speak out against the church's model of the universe, which put the earth at the center of the universe. Just like today, the federal government uses the same tactics against any scientist who speaks out against the similarly irrational tenets of the federal regulators like the EPA, which says that toxic heavy metals, industrial waste, and chemicals and deadly cancer-causing agents are safe when they're locked in soil. So you can spread them on farms and they'll never go into the food and they won't harm anyone. That's an irrational belief that's far more irrational than thinking the earth is flat, for that matter. So, we can give lots of examples where government regulators are more insane, irrational, and anti-scientific than even the flat earthers. So keep all that in mind. Thanks for listening. My name is Mike Adams, the Health Ranger. If you'd like to check out my book, Food Forensics, you can download the first section of it for free at foodforensics.com. My laboratory, which is about to launch commercial lab testing services, is found at cwclabs.com. Stands for Consumer Wellness Center Labs. And my website is naturalnews.com. Check them all out, and you'll be amazed at what you learn that the institutions of science won't tell you. Thanks for listening. Take care. Hey, I've got a lot of amazing videos coming this year. Click subscribe now to stay informed when I release them.